The following instructions are based on the assumption that the correct joint tightness and guide pin setting has been established and that you are thoroughly familiar with the jig's use when routing single joints. These twin joints were made with the included 5/16 by 1.5 inch guide and 5/16 inch bit. Twin tenon workpieces can be up to a maximum of 3 by 3 1/8 inches, with tenon sizes up to 1/2 by 2.5 inches. The maximum spacing is 9/16 of an inch, and the maximum distance from the board edge to the center of the tenon is 2 3/8 inches. Mark the location of your two tenon centers. Be sure to allow space between the two joints at least slightly greater than the tenon bit diameter. It's only necessary to mark the left to right position on the mortise board. It can be helpful to mark the location of the tenon board on the mortise board. Mark the faces that go against the clamp plate. Then flip the tenon board over and mark the bit depth on the opposite side. Pull the sight forward to its stop, and with the marked side toward the clamp plate, place the tenon board against the side stop fence. Bring it up to lightly touch the underside of the sight and clamp it in place. Release the table and sight the front tenon. Lock the table. Move both left-right limit stops against the stop post and tighten them with the hex screwdriver. Position the rear front-back limit stop against the stop post and tighten it. Then release the table and sight the back tenon. Lock the table and move the front-back limit stop against the stop post and tighten it. Release the table and move it front to back against the stops to double-check the tenon sighting. Then lock the table and retract the sight. The table is now set up to route both the mortises and the tenons. We recommend beginners use a small, 1/4 inch thick shop-made guard in the guide recess to prevent routing into the other tenon. Place the router on the jig and route the rear tenon. Lower the bit and start by climb routing clockwise without touching the guide pin on the guide to create a clean shoulder. Then route counterclockwise with the guide pin against the guide to complete the tenon. Turn off the power, raise the plunge, and remove the router from the table. Release the table and move it to the front tenon position. Lock the table and move the guard to the rear of the guide recess. Place the router back on the jig and route the front tenon. Again, start by climb routing clockwise. And finish up the tenon by routing counterclockwise. Both tenons are now complete. Remove the tenon workpiece from the jig. Remove and save the guard, as it is not required when routing the mortises. Extend the sight. With the clamps repositioned and the marked side toward the clamp plate, position the mortise board so that it is centered under the sight. The front to back positions were already preset with the tenon board. Secure the mortise board with the clamps. Retract the sight. Place the router on the table with the left guide pin in the mortise slot of the guide. Raise the plunge stop slightly to allow the mortise to be deeper than the tenon. Plunge the router and route the front mortise, starting with a series of overlapping plunge cuts at full depth. Then lock the plunge at full depth and clean out the mortise. Raise the plunge but leave the router in place. Release the table and move it to the rear mortise position. Lock the table and route the rear mortise. Finish up routing the mortise and remove the router from the jig. Both mortises are now complete. Remove the mortise board from the jig. Then insert the tenon board in the mortise board. The result is a perfectly matching twin mortise and tenon joint.